Welcome to another Strength2Food podcast special. Strength2Food is a 5-year EU-funded project under Horizon 2020. If you're interested in hearing more about the project, I've included a brief description at the end of this episode. But for now, I'm your host, Jane Alice Liu. I'm a science communicator, and in this episode, we're going to explore the sustainability and future of organic farming in the European Union. I'm joined by Burkhard Shaer, an agriculture engineer who helped evaluate the economic, social, and environmental impacts of food quality schemes in the EU under the Strength2Food project. We deep dive into the world of organic, discussing the broader social benefits of organic farming, challenges that still need to be overcome, the role of retailers and consumers, intensive case studies of different organic sectors, and much, much more.
I'm Burkhard Shaer. I'm an agriculture engineer, trained in Germany, German born and raised. And I did a PhD on organic food supply chain as long as 25 years ago. 20 years ago, I created a company together with two colleagues called ECOZEPT, and we are dealing with sustainable food and agriculture systems. In Strength2Food, our main work was in organic. We did the analysis of sectors such as organic pig, organic rice, organic yogurt. And this is what we do in our everyday work as well.
Well, then, given your background in organic farming, Burkhard, let's just get into the basics of organic farming. So what exactly is organic farming defined within the EU?
Defined within the EU, the oldest European law about organic farming is now more than 30 years old. Synthetic chemicals and fertilizers are completely prohibited. And what is particular about the law is that we have a positive list of things that you can use, which means it's really very clear. You have a list and you can check, I can use this or okay, I can't. It's not that the human creativity kicks in and finds a lot of alternatives that are close to. It's very restricted. On top of this, we have an interdiction of GMO, and we have particularly high standards when it comes to animal welfare.
So then what are the benefits of organic farming?
So the benefit that we expect from this way of farming is protection of resources, air, water, biodiversity. Protection of health. We expect big progress in terms of animal welfare.
Yeah, I think with organic farming, most of the time people might assume immediately that, it's environmental benefits, but I think it actually broadly extends much farther beyond that, right? I mean, just looking at some of the work that your team has done, there's also things that was impacted, such as producer bargaining power or wages, long-term supply contracts, and also in addition to animal welfare. So I think these are definitely the benefits that aren't as common knowledge, I think, compared to the environmental benefits.
You're very right to put the finger on this point, because this is where organic has a leverage effect on what is happening in supply chains. And actually, thanks to organic, a part of the trade of agriculture and food products is reinvented, is redefined, and farmers get more power. And then there's new processing facilities, small-scale companies who have a better stand in the market than they have in the conventional market.
Mm-hmm. And then what would be the limitations of organic farming?
The first and the most evident one is the lower yield. So it depends on what you're producing, but easily have 30% less yield in organic. But that's the average, which means that you have a higher variation of yield as well in organic.
Is that depending on the crop or depending on...
That depends on the crop very much. Classic example, you may take potatoes. You can have almost the same yield in a good year, and you can have next to nothing in a bad year. Because when a pest is hitting potatoes and you don't have any pesticide at hand, then you just have to wait for the next year. And this is why products are partly more expensive. Yeah. So that's one important limitation. And here we need research. This is why we still need a lot of research. And it goes even further, because as we have less yields, we cannot afford to feed the same amount of animals. If we imagine a very high percentage of organic in the food sector, like 70% or 100%, why not? Let's think about it. then we can probably not afford to feed as much pig and poultry as we do today. And we cannot afford to produce as much meat. So this implies that in order to have organic developed on a very broad scale, we have to change food and consumption habits. And that's a long-term process, and it has to fit into what's happening on the fields. So what's happening on the plate, what's happening in the consumer's fridge, and what's happening on the field has to be, in a way, synchronized, and that's a complex process. And here policy kicks in and society kicks in, and this adaptation process can hinder. It does not today. Today, organic is booming.
That was actually the next question, which is, how has organic farming and consumption changed within the last decades? Has it increased? Has it stabilized? Or is it now decreasing?
It has increased. And if you look at the data from the last 20 years, from 2000 onwards, it's surprisingly steady. If you look at the European average, it's just a steady growth. You may look at the market or at the area. Just goes on and on and on and on. Then we had the big economic crisis in 2008. And if you look at the European data, it just goes on and on and on and on. And if there just was nothing happening. So that's very, very reassuring. There's something very stable, very powerful, which is behind this trend and which allows this growth. As far as I know, there is one country on world level where organic stepped back significantly over several years, and that's the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, we had a special situation after the financial crisis in 2008, and we lost market share and we lost share in services. But in all the other countries, even if there were short moments of stepping back, there was always growth.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that organic farming and consumption has been increasing. I'm a bit curious as to whether or not you know if this is for our particular consumer profile, right? So is this typically maybe people who can afford to buy organic products, or are people who might be a little bit more stretched for finances also investing in organic products?
Yeah, I think this is the crucial point. In early years and until perhaps 2010 or something like that, the socioeconomic profile of the organic consumer was very clear. Those were the rich and the well-educated. Now, today, we have almost 90% of the population who is more or less regularly consuming organic, and it's getting quite difficult to identify a socioeconomic profile, which is typical for organic. Nonetheless, among the most intensive consumers, the high educated and those who are well off are still overrepresented. On the other hand, the market is growing, and within the market we have a nice diversification. I mean, Lidl and Aldi and other discounters, you find those organic products everywhere. And in Germany, for example, Aldi and Lidl are the biggest sellers of organic products. They have the biggest market share in organic. More than half of all organic fresh carrots and potatoes are sold on discount. It's enormous. And here you hit consumer groups who are not particularly well off, but who find this attractive and who at least from time to time will buy organic. So I think there is a diversification taking place. And within this diversification, more and more people buy more and more organic.
Right. And so actually going back to what you were saying earlier about how it takes everybody within the supply chain, the food system, including consumers, to really push forward organic farming and consumption, it shows here that retailers also have quite a big role in that as well.
It does. And this is interesting when you look at the retailer's behavior. I mean, we all know how powerful retail is, and we know how much retailers use this power in conventional farming. They were destroying a lot of family existences and put farmers into difficulties because they were not ready to pay higher prices. In organic, at least, since a couple of years, the situation is the opposite. The retailer is looking for organic farmers. The retailer is engaging into contracts. The retailer is guaranteeing prices. Something that never happens in conventional farming since a long time. Here we have 5-year contracts, or even in Germany you have an example of 10-year contracts for organic pork.
Did this shift begin with organic products, or was it part of already a shift in mentality from retailers, you think?
I think it is actually a shift in mentality, but it shows first and most precisely in organic. Organic is in a way a flagship policy for retailers, so they try to do a lot of good work in this sector.
So, Burkhard, how can we ensure that organic products are truly organic in the EU, including imported organic products?
The European law rules the certification. It's, generally speaking, a very solid system, which is financed by the market actors. It's not publicly financed. Here in organic, it's the sector, finally the consumer, who pay for the control. And then there's control bodies who do strict and competent work. We still have, of course, fraud. Fraud is happening everywhere. It should be lower than 1% in organic, but there still is 1% fraud. In other schemes, we know that there are rather 10% fraud.
Do you think that the role of traceability and finding perhaps technologies that could better help with traceability would really help reduce this 1%?
I think this is necessary. This is what a lot of organic food supply chain actors are working on. And this is actually in today's organization of the control system a weak point, because we don't have traceability without gray spots or white spots. Traceability is not 100% guaranteed. It's batch control. So you have batches that travel through the world, and if somebody changes the batch label, then it's relatively easy to fraud. As I say, it's much more difficult than in other labeling schemes.
I mean, to be very honest, Burkhard, I'm quite surprised that it's only just 1%.
Because we talk a lot about the fraud there.
Yeah, indeed. And the organic label, I think, is quite well trusted amongst European consumers. But I just find it a bit interesting also with imports. For example, I know I had discussed with another doctorate who was working on organic, and I had the question of, well, how do we ensure that within the EU that these organic products from other countries meet the standards of the EU? And he was saying, yeah, well, there's actually, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Burkhard, but from my understanding, other countries need to have standards that are approved by the EU to be able to be classified as EU certified bio. Is this the case? Because I suppose I personally always wondered, or I always thought that the EU standards were just way, way above other countries in terms of organic.
Simplifying, there are two ways to import organic legally. One is in the country, in the concerned country, there is a system that is considered equivalent by the European Union. And then you can look into details and you can say that, well, there's one detail or another which is not finally that equivalent. But it's Japan, for example, it's the US, it's Canada, it's Israel. The list is longer. And then you have other countries where you don't have equivalent national system. And then the legislation obliges the food supply chain actors to transpose the European system, which means that the control bodies from the European Union go into the country, check whether this is corresponding to European legislation or not, which in reality means that in almost every country of the world, you have a bureau of European control bodies. It might be the company which name is very close to ours, ECOZEPT, or there are a lot of others, Control, or there are a lot of other European control bodies, private companies who do the control on the demand of the market actors. And they have their offices and their agents all over the world, and those people control. So it's either the same legislation, and then the EU is just putting confidence in the capacity that they apply their own legislation, or we transpose the European system.
Right, I see. I just suppose I was wondering because, for example, in the EU, if we have the positive list of what we can use, what if, other chemicals that aren't on this list are used in other countries, but then it doesn't sound like that's the way that it's necessarily assessed.
I think that would be an example relatively easily to be excluded through the analyses that are done. On the other hand, you're, of course, right. When you look at fraud, most of the fraud happens when there is a third country implemented. One of the last scandals was Kazakhstan products that ran through Turkey, went through Italy, and were finally used in France. Well, then there were 3 borders crossed, 3 labels changed, 4 companies implicated, and the trace was lost. So there were criminals at work. You need criminal energy. It's not easy. And you risk to be excluded from the business. So there's a difference. In Europe, the punishment is that you're excluded of the organic market. You're not authorized to use the organic label any longer if you're caught frauding. There are some countries like France or Germany where you actually risk legal punishment. You go to prison. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In Germany, you go to prison.
But I can understand, I think if we're as serious about organic farming as we should be, then we should have higher stakes, right, to protect this, right?
I mean, it's very attractive. Change the label and say 3 times more expensive. Of course, it's tempting.
I guess it's also a lot about trust as well, right? Trust and incentive, both.
It's a lot about trust, but I don't want to shock you, but trust and mistrust is part of the organic consumer behavior. Consumers are not necessarily having very much trust in organic. And that's not a problem, actually, because no consumer is 100% organic. And most of the consumers have an inner voice which is telling them you should buy more organic. So there's always this bad conscience, I should buy more. And each time there's a fraud, organic consumers or these intermediate organic consumers, they're quite happy. They say, well done. I did finally not buy as much as I could. And I was not a victim of fraud.
Right.
And
like I knew it. I always knew there was going to be an issue.
But this is not keeping them from buying more and more.
Okay, I see.
So I think the scheme it's putting people at ease with their own cognitive dissonance that there's a fraud from time to time. That's the only thing. That's a personal hypothesis.
All right, so those were just the basics, Burkhard, and now maybe we can get into the deeper subject, which is that the EU has set a target now for 25% of agricultural land to be used under organic farming by 2030. To me, this sounds like a great feat, but what exactly would it take for us to reach that target?
It would take for us very precisely that we continue the development that we had since 2016. If we just continue on the same path that we stepped on in 2016, then we will reach the target. We did the extrapolation in several projects, and we extrapolated what was happening on farm level and on consumption level. And if we just continue and go on and on and on, then we will reach precisely the target. I bet that the European Union did the same extrapolation.
Oh, so what you're saying is that we're already on track to reaching the 25% agriculture.
We are on a nice track. And we have to resolve some qualitative issues, of course, like I said, yields, quality, organization of food supply chain. But in general, we are on a nice track. Well, of course, there's challenges because this implies that, for example, agriculture policy is more or less acting during the next 10 years as it did the last 5 years. And we know how changing policies can be in different countries, for example. So if we have strong political signs that discourage or confuse organic farmers and which hinder them from convert their farms, then we might have a challenge. We need continued policy. We need stability in policy. Even more than we need encouragement from policy, we need stability. If policy has a stop-and-go attitude, then everybody's confused and nobody will convert to organic farming. And converting a farm is a decision that a farmer does once in a lifetime because he's engaging his biography here. He's engaging his entire revenue, his family revenue in most of the European countries as well, a history of a farmer family of several hundred years. So there's a huge emotional and economic load that comes along with the decision. So it's not an easy decision. It's a very, very, very difficult decision.
Yeah, and personally, I always assumed as well that converting to organic farming does take quite an investment as well, not just emotional, but also economic. Just to pour in enough monetary investment to make sure that you replace the synthetic chemicals that was probably much cheaper than other practices under organic farming.
You're perfectly right. It takes 8 years to overcome the investment costs. During 8 years, an organic farmer is earning less money than his conventional neighbor because he had to invest.
Okay, so then are there any policies in place to help subsidize farms that actually convert to organic farming?
Yes, and it's very different from country to country. It's very country specific. But in most countries, we have two kinds of subsidies. One is for the conversion period. But in most time, they subsidize only during 3 years, some during 5 years. But from economy, we know that the conversion crisis, is lasting eight years. So that's the one policy instrument. And the other policy instrument is maintaining organic farming. Once you have converted, you still get an annual payment per hectare in order to compensate the variation of yields and the lower yields.
Okay. Do you have any idea of how many farms have actually converted since 2016 to organic farming?
Several tens of thousands, of course. In France, there were years where we had several hundred farmers per month who were converting. Now it has slowed down a little, but there are quite some tens of thousands of organic farms now in Europe. And then, of course, you have the size difference. You have countries where organic farms are very small, like in Austria, and then you have countries where they're very huge, like in Ukraine.
So which country actually has the largest amount of organic agricultural land within the EU?
It's Austria, if I'm not mistaken, more than 20% now.
Wow, it's very impressive.
Yeah, it's very impressive, but then you have to look at Austria, which is an alpine country with a lot of meadows and a lot of prairies, and these are easy to convert.
Right. Actually, are there certain crops or livestock that would be easier to convert to organic practices? Or suppose that also in this case, are there certain lands that are easier to convert to organic?
As a matter of fact, meadows and prairies, which are easily to be converted. And when you have extensive livestock management, like cattle grazing or ewes, then you can quite easily convert to organic. Dairy cows sector can quite easily be converted. Then on a gradient, you have the crops like cereals or rapeseed or these kind of crops. This is already quite difficult because you have to switch from an agriculture where you only have, let's say, 3 or 4 crops to a rotation. This is much more complex. In organic, you have a much more complex rotation. So you have at least 8 crops on the same field. During 8 years, the same crop is not grown again. In a conventional agriculture, you can grow the same crop on the field every second year or every third year. So in organic, it's much more complex. And then it's getting more and more difficult when you look into fruit and vegetable production. Fruit even more difficult than vegetable. And the most challenging sector where we have the biggest delay in converting or the biggest gap as well when it comes to demand is pig and poultry. Pig and poultry in conventional is something where you concentrate a lot of animals in a very small space and where you manage diseases and illness by
antibiotics and
any other kind of artificial help. In organic, you don't have those little helpers, and you have by law to organize a lot of space for your animals. You need 10 square meters per organic hen. That's a lot of space. And if you look in the conventional, it's just a tenth of a square meter. So that's 100 times more.
Yeah. Although I have also heard conflicting information about chickens is that they actually tend to like to cuddle together.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be given more space, but of course it just, I can kind of understand why farmers try to optimize the amount of space used. But I think it's been, of course, taken too far, right? With you've seen battery farms.
I'm an agriculture engineer, and my first sympathy goes always with the farmers. And I do very well understand all their reasoning and their economic reasoning as well. But then when it comes to animal welfare, we see today that we went too far. Consumers don't accept it any longer, and it's getting difficult for farmers as well. They don't feel good with it. The world has changed.
And so going into more of the Strength2Food project, Burkhard, what findings from the Strength2Food project fit within this organic framework set out by the EU? I know that Strength2Food has worked a lot on short supply chains and food quality schemes. So I think it'd be very interesting to just see how this fits together with this target that the EU is hoping to achieve.
What was really new in Strength2Food was that we did a lot of intensive case studies and in-depth data from every case.
Right. And this is in specific to organic farming, intensive.
This is as well true for organic, but all the other supply chains that we've been looking on, like short food supply chain and labeling schemes like origin labeled products.
Then getting into the organic examples. So there were two examples that I looked through the findings that I think would be very interesting for our audience. So the first being organic pork meat in Germany. Seeing as how we were talking about poultry and pork being quite intensive. So how is the sustainability assessment of pork meat in Germany? Is it really more sustainable than conventionally produced pork meat from the findings of the Strength2Food project?
In general, yes. And then there are some points where the difference is not as clear. For example, when it comes to water use and when it comes to the water footprint, even the carbon footprint, we have a challenge to face. Organic animals grow much slower than conventional animals. This is why all the huge space that they need by law, they occupy this space during longer time. And they get more feed. And they produce more manure because they live longer. So this has to put into a balance to the fact that the feed is produced in a much more sustainable way, much less impact on water, much less impact on air, but more food. So we have to be sure in organic that we don't consume the credit that we have from plant production when feeding it to animals. We have, for example, to be very careful to feed as much waste to animals as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you feed all the waste cereals to pigs, then you hardly have any problem. If you produce cereals especially for feeding them to pigs, then you have a problem. In the organic, for sure, you have a problem. So I think this was differentiated in the report as well. Organic pork can receive fish meal, but by law, it has to be waste from fish production, while conventional pork can be fed with fish meal that is especially produced as animal feed. And this brings already a big difference in the sustainability assessment.
Right. I think it was interesting, and why I wanted to bring up this example is because, of course, when we talk about sustainable diets, meat is usually on the lower end of that. And so I think that it's interesting, the definition of sustainability. Maybe here it would be good to actually clarify for the audience, what are specific sustainable factors that the Strength2Food method looked at? Because I think, of course, sustainability is quite a broad concept, but you actually set out very specific factors and indicators that was examined for these case studies.
Of course. I mean, it was an arbitrary choice, or it was a pragmatic choice as well, that we had to do at the very beginning of the project. And we decided to focus on water, on air, on social factors such as competence building, gender equality, bargaining power. And we excluded some of indicators like biodiversity or animal welfare, because even in five or 6 years ago when we started, there was much less literature on these domains, and it was much more difficult to get the food on the ground here. So we tried to stick to those indicators which were reliably measurable when we started our work. And I think with most of the indicators, we can encourage the agriculture policy to continue to encourage high quality food supply chains or short food supply chains, quality labels, and organic farming.
Okay. Because I just think that when we talk about sustainability, and for maybe the vegetarians and vegans who might be listening, they might really wonder, okay, well then how are we defining sustainability for pork meat, for example?
It's completely right what you're saying. And I said that we were not looking at biodiversity, we were not looking at animal welfare, we were not looking at health neither. What you're implying is, of course, the future challenge of the entire agro-food sector, because we will have in any way to reduce meat consumption. Vegan is a big trend, but we know that most consumers are rather flexitarians than real vegetarians or vegans. But we will, in order to have a sustainable food and agriculture sector, the entire planet has to eat less meat.
Right. And then even though we eat less meat, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any meat production, right? So that the meat production that does still take place does need to be more sustainable.
Right.
Right. And so I think that in this case with the pork meat in Germany, already there is one actionable that farmers could take on if they want to make it more sustainable, which is to feed the pigs waste from cereals. So then moving on to the second example, which is organic tomatoes grown in Italy. How exactly are organic tomatoes grown in Italy more sustainable than conventionally grown tomatoes? And are they even more sustainable?
They are more sustainable. They have a much lower demand, of course, in pesticides, and consequently a lower impact on water quality. We have much higher social indicators as well. Farmers and workers on these farms are getting, thanks to their work, higher competence. They have higher bargaining power. Even the supply chain is differently organized, which means it is shorter, and transportation distance from the production site to processing site is much shorter than in the conventional average. So this brought us to a lower carbon footprint as well. The special thing was that we were analyzing processed tomatoes. And so we always looked at the interaction between the processing site and the tomato farmer.
And I think what was interesting for me about this particular example was the social indicator side, because within Italy, because retailers had such a big power over tomato farmers, they didn't actually have that high of a bargaining power. So it was more like a reverse auction, right? So whoever has the lowest price, who can sell us the lowest price for tomatoes, will buy it off of you. So you had this who can go lower for retailers. But what this created was tension for the farmers. So now they had to take cuts for their own profit. And where could they cut was labor, right? So then there was illegal labor going on within the conventional side of tomato growing in Italy. There was a gang master is what they called this middleman who actually brought in immigrants to work on these farms, and there was a lot of exploitation there involved. So I think this is why this example of organic tomatoes grown in Italy and the social indicators were so interesting to me, because it really sounded like the producers themselves had much more power in terms of being able to get paid what their product is worth, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think these were two really, really interesting examples. And moving on to the next question then, what are the most successful modes of distribution of organic products? So I know Strength2Food works a lot with shorter supply chains, of course, but for example, direct trade, public procurement, what are some of the most successful modes of distribution?
Well, we have to differentiate a lot between countries, but if you look at it historically, you have, of course, direct selling from farmers. And you have a special retail sector that was especially invented for organic farming, which is the organic specialized retail. So all these organic food stores that you find in a lot of European countries, and who are sharing like 30 or 40% of the market in some of the countries like the Netherlands, France, or Germany. But on the other hand, we have countries where the entire organic market was developed by conventional retail. Like in Austria or in Switzerland. Even in the UK, you have a situation where it was actually the conventional retail who took up the risk to develop an organic offer. So I cannot really judge whether there is one distribution channel which is more successful than another, but what I clearly experience in my work is for good development, you need several stable retail channels. If you have a country where there is good direct selling, good specialized distribution and dynamic conventional retail, then everything's fine. Then even if one of the three drops out, the two others can bring stability and good bargaining powers to farmers.
Right. That makes complete sense. Because if you have a diverse group, you don't put all your eggs in one basket is how the saying goes, right?
You need two legs to stand on.
Yes, exactly. So then how do organic supply chains withstand pressure from natural disasters or high demand? For example, I mean, we look at the impact of COVID-19, right?
We did research on this, not in the framework of Strength2Food, but in two other small projects that we ran by ourselves. And we were interviewing processing companies all over Europe, like 20 expert interviews. And we interviewed 100 organic food stores in France. And in both studies, results suggest that thanks to these contracts that exist quite frequently in organic supply chains, they could resist better to this peak of demand than conventional supply chains. And here we have the situation of COVID, which is very particular. But if you look at natural disasters, you have, I think, very much to differentiate. Of course, if you have pests, an invasion of bacteria or fungi or insects, you can't fight them. So you will have to do with it, and probably you will live a bad year or sleepless nights when you're a farmer. When it comes to natural challenges that are like climate change, organic is better off because we have this rotation that I've been talking about when it comes to farming, to cropping. So this rotation with several crops is reducing the risk per crop. And we have information that organic farming is better resisting to drought, better resisting to these extreme climate effects that we had these last years.
All right. And just wrapping up, we have only a few more questions left, Burkhard. But what is the role of organic labeling to help us reach the 2030 target in terms of how it can help consumers recognize whether or not something is bio or not?
I think organic labeling is the baseline. It's a common playground where everybody stands upon. And it has to be continued as it is, more or less, as a guarantee, which is more or less trusted. I said there is always some mistrust. I'm not finding it necessarily very problematic that not everybody is trusting. But that's not the problem. But we have to continue this work on organic is a good solution. Organic is part of the solution. The organic labeling is standing for a certification system that is working on this common ground. And in the developing market, we can now diversify with brands and with other labels that come on top of organic as we wish. There's a lot of fantasy possible now. I wouldn't have said the same thing 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I'd say, let's focus everybody on organic. But today I'm saying easily, go organic plus, go organic and fair trade, go organic and local, go organic and special quality, etc., etc.
Of course, organic labeling is also, it helps build extra incentive as well for people to join from the organic farming perspective, right? Conversion. Because then consumers will pay the higher price for this because it is organic. But I also wonder, maybe this is more of a spin-off question, Burkhard, but organic products, should they actually be as expensive as they are labeled? Is that really a justified price difference? Or are there certain factors that the consumer is not seeing when we see that higher price?
I think to a certain extent, higher prices are necessary, and conventional food today is too cheap. It's rather the problem is rather there. That's the easy question, because that's very political, and then we can ask for higher prices for conventional food and everybody will be happy. And consumers will not be able to travel to the Caribbean every year and drive big sport cars, etc., etc. Then we will have a shift of consumer spending. And that's what happened precisely during COVID crisis. People could not travel. They had a lot of money left. What did they do with the money? They bought 20% more organic. That was one of the main things that they did. 20% more organic. Yeah, why not? We don't go to the restaurant any longer. A lot of money saved. So back to organic and where are the hidden costs and where is the potential to save money and get organic products cheaper to the consumers. There is a problem in extra margin taken, of course. There are some products where retailers or some processors take some extra money. Perhaps 5% on the average or 3%. It's not the bigger part of it, but of course there's some margin taking here thanks to the boom. But then we have a real problem of efficient supply chains and as well of economies of scale. All our organic food processors are much smaller, most of them are most smaller than conventional sites. And if you imagine your huge factories where you run your organic products through, then you have much less specific cost per product than you have in the small artisanal medium enterprise processing site that you have in organic. So there's specifically higher costs, but which is giving specifically jobs, specifically income to more people. I think it's in the context of reorganizing our food system.
Yeah, and how we value our food as well.
Right.
Yeah, economically.
Let's talk about it in 10 years, and I think both of us will spend more on food in general. Everybody will spend more food. And look at the conventional sector. Take off, what was the big discussion in pesticides and conventional? Glyphosate. Take glyphosate out of conventional farming tomorrow. 10 days later, you will have higher prices by 10 or something %.
Wow, just with that pesticide alone.
Yeah. Because it's saving a lot of money to farmers. But it's not saving money for the entire society because it's generating costs elsewhere. So
right. And also long-term consequences on the environment as well, right?
Yeah,
I think
that we don't even know.
Right, and that's the thing with organic farming is that it's being more conscious with how we farm and to make sure that we're not just taking from our land, but making sure that we're also making the land able to be used in the long term. It's not just about the short-term production.
That would be the objective, of course, right?
Yeah, but I think it would be very interesting to know what exactly goes behind the cost of organic produce, because I think, like I said, it's a very hot topic amongst even conscious consumers. There's this €5 broccoli really worth €5, right?
No, I think a factor 5 is never justified. A factor 2 euros instead of 1 can be justified in a lot of legume and fruit categories. In milk, don't buy any milk that is more than 30% more expensive than conventional one. I mean, there's somebody taking extra margin, or there has to be an extra quality with it, like local or other special thing. But
yeah, or I don't know if the shop is paying their employees more for their income, the actual people that are working in the retail shop. Maybe.
We had scandals in organic food stores in Germany where people were paid less than at Lidl's. So you never can trust anybody. You always have to look closely to it. Yeah.
But this is the problem with the food system, huh? It's like
this is a problem. Of course, everybody, if Lidl does pay his employees badly, nobody's complaining. That's normal. That's Lidl. But if an organic food store does the same thing, then it's something immoral. So organic has this special challenge as well. We always have to be better with regard to all the criteria.
Right. But I am quite impressed that Lidl and Aldi are two of the biggest suppliers of organic produce. And I would hope that they don't mark up the price so much, especially for the demographic that typically goes there to purchase their goods, right? But it is an impressive start, let's say.
It is. And until now, farmers who work with them are satisfied with the work. They are getting good prices.
It's very good to know. All right. So last 2 questions, Burkhard. Do you think it's realistic because this is within Europe, right? But could we feed the world if the entire world's agricultural landscape changed to organic farming?
But there are several studies from the FAO, for example, who told us that, yes, we can. I'd say if we have an imaginary button here that we just push and tomorrow everybody should work on organic, then we have a huge problem. But if you give us like 10 or 20 or 30 years time, then of course we can reorganize what's happening, but it will imply a thorough change in consumption habits, a drastic reduction of the consumption of animal protein. Animal protein is including eggs, is including milk, but is foremost pork and poultry meat. This will be necessary but we will not even be able to feed the world in a conventional way if we continue as we do today.
That's also a fair point. Do you think that organic farming should perhaps be combined with maybe other practices? For example, well, it's not really practice, but more of an approach, regenerative agriculture, for example, permaculture, for example. So just these different approaches mixed together with organic farming practices, maybe it could also help accelerate things in a more positive direction as well.
I agree completely, and I'm against any ideological delimitation of organic farming on research level and on farming level. I think on these levels, we really have to be open for cooperation and for mutual inspiration. On the other hand, we have to be very, very clear about the separation of organic and all the other ways of more sustainable farming. When it comes to trading the products and marketing the products to the consumer. Here we have to be very, very clear because we cannot explain the complexity of regenerative farming to consumers. They will not understand. I think the only way of sustainable farming that consumers understand today is organic farming. Even if they don't know the details, but they got the message. We brought good arguments to sound consumer communication, thanks to Strength2Food.
All right. So, Burkhard, just to wrap up now, are there any additional thoughts you'd like to share before we close this episode?
It was nice to do this discussion with you. It was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for listening in on this podcast special. The Strength2Food project aims to improve the effectiveness of EU food quality schemes, public sector food procurement, and to stimulate short food supply chains through research, innovation, and demonstration activities. To find out more about the Strength2Food project, you can visit Strength2Food, that's 2 as in the number 2.eu.